Hi everybody, welcome to episode 2 of our series, Clean, Green, Renewable, Sustainable, or CGRS for short. My name is Suresh Venkat. Today's theme is Design for Sustainability. This series, Clean, Green, Renewable, Sustainable, is brought to you by Invest in Denmark and is supported by 3 of our partners. So before we go further, thank you to ADI, the Association of Designers of India, Climate Collective, and Ethos. Now, when we talk about sustainability, we often think only about environmental sustainability, green energy, protecting biodiversity, reducing pollution, and all the good stuff like that. But a key aspect of sustainability is what is called long-term social good. This means health, it means healthcare, food, water, livelihoods, and most importantly, dignity for everybody in the world. These are all aspects of sustainability. Today, we have 2 speakers who are going to talk about some of these aspects of sustainability. We have Lotte Lyngsted Jepsen from Denmark and Jacob Matthew from Bangalore. Before I tell you a little bit more about them, may I invite Jette Bajrum. Jette is the Consul General and Head of Trade and the Innovation Center, Ministry of Foreign Affairs in Denmark. She's based out of Bangalore. Jette, over to you.
Very good afternoon to everybody. Welcome to Lotte and Jacob. Thank you so much for taking your time to share with us your views and insights. I'm super excited to also get the opportunity to elaborate a little bit about design as seen from a Danish perspective, because I was so lucky that I attended the Design for India in Pune. And Venkat, we also met there back in, I think it was in early Jan. And I remember Index, at that time, Danish Index, saying that actually design is a way to solve ugly problems, and that they can pave a way for, sustainable solutions, but how to make life better for the people at large. And if we don't regard design as a tool and as a method to include that in the way we think of business and architecture and engineering, we're missing out an opportunity. And this is why design as a topic is super interesting and relevant, but it's also a little bit difficult. And I also remember that Index said that if you look at design, how do you explain how to learn more about design if you're not a design person? And basically what you could do is to look at design as a language. How do we all learn a new language? If I had to learn Chinese or another, at my age, at some point when I was younger, we had to learn Russian. How do we do that? I don't speak Hindi. How do we handle that? How do we address design as if we wanted to learn a new language? I think that's a very interesting way of addressing it and explaining also the approach to it. So if we use design as a language and look at it as a language, that also means we have to learn how to teach it and how to bring it into a tool in play in our daily life. And also, if we want to use design as part of our AI and our machine learning technologies, which is also being used to solve critical problems, we have to figure out a good way for non-designers to understand how to do that. And that's why I'm excited to hear both Lotte and Jacob today to see, so what is your take on this? Another interesting thing is also about, using products, designing products, and I also elaborated that a little bit in January. Actually, in Denmark at least, we know that 80% of all buying decisions in households are actually made by women, and we also know that a lot of design, product design, central design decisions, and management decisions are taken to a large extent by men. What does that mean in terms of meeting the need of our consumers? How can we use design to be an inclusive, let's say, getting everybody on board tool? How are products actually customized in a sustainability manner? We also know that up to 30% of the young generation will work with solutions and in jobs that are today not even created. So what does that mean in terms of how we use design in our education? How do we teach at school? And what skills do we actually ask people to look for when we want to design our talents and education programs? I mean, I'm born in 1965 though, but let's say people born after 2007, they will most probably celebrate their 100 years birthday. What does that mean to our daily lives, our impact, and the way we design the way we live? I want to just say very briefly that in terms of healthcare specifically, I have spent 30 years in healthcare. I come from private sector. And right now in Bangalore, where we host our trade council, where we also have healthcare and renewable energy, we also host our innovation center. We have 8 centers in the world. One of them is in Bangalore, and Invest in Denmark, which my colleague Shankar is heading. Right now, we're working on a green health project. And why are we doing that? That's because we want to try to see how can we design the way we work with healthcare in a different way to actually combine sustainable solutions into black healthcare, if you might say so. One of the examples that we actually do is actually work with the antibiotic resistance, because we know that that's from a Danish perspective. We have some very strong skills into that, but also that's the #1 issue in India. So how can we design our way through, understand ourselves, what does it mean to use design in green healthcare? So it's just one example where we're actually trying to take the medicine ourselves to drive projects that actually address plate change solutions, new drug delivery systems, and also the way we educate ourselves to use drugs and healthcare solutions into a more, let's say, preventive manner. And design also plays a very important role here. So I think that design has many faces, can be looked upon in many different ways. And this is why I think it's super interesting to hear your take today as to, you are the experts. What does that actually mean? How can we do it even better? And how can we bridge the Indo-Danish collaboration in that sense? As Denmark, as a country, we are also based on a social design model, the way we have designed our democracy. Basically, design is one of our main raw capability materials actually coming out of Denmark. So this is why design means a lot, but it can also be a little bit fluffy. So I hope this seminar and this webinar this afternoon would also bring more clarity to understanding design. So thank you so much for letting me open in this session, and I'm looking forward so much to listen to you experts. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jette. Our first speaker is Lotte Lyngsted Jepsen. Lotte is the co-founder and director of circular design at Kirk Hatch & Bloom. Kirk Hatch & Bloom, of course, is a Copenhagen-based design thinking and innovation consulting company. Now, Denmark, as you may well know, has a large number of older people, and those people need to be looked after. Lotte is going to talk about a project called the Good Kitchen that helped feed Denmark's senior citizens using design thinking. Lotte, for the next 20 minutes, over to you.
Thank you so much. So I'm going to talk about a project that we did called The Good Kitchen, which is actually a bit back to you, Jette, talking about how to apply the design methodology on services for elderly in this case. For those of you who might not know that much about the design approach, I'm just quickly going to run through this. But basically, it's about looking into how to address or uncover the right problem by using some of the traditional methodologies from anthropology, ethnography, sociology, which is interviews, going into the field, studying, observing how people are behaving in the field. Then it's once you've isolated the right problem, the first iteration is basically what I think of design thinking. But then the second iteration is design doing. So it's how to design the right solution for this problem. And as with most of our projects, this is a slightly more detailed version of that model. And we go through these 5 different phases in our projects. So we have the dream phase or the definition phase, where we define the typical project. Then we have the discover phase, which is interviews, observations, dialogues, workshops. Then we define the problem, we design and test, and then we deliver a final solution. And I think this is what makes design as a methodology as strong a methodology in working with issues like this, which are slightly more complex because they have behavior, they have policy, they have technology, they have different kind of business models and so forth merging into each other. So I think by actually looking at what the end users or the users who are going to use this service would actually prefer, and testing this live before you actually scale it, enables a company or a municipality in this case to actually risk mitigate and make sure that things that they are actually implementing have a high hit rate. In this project, we had the challenge. The task was commissioned by the Danish Ministry of Health as a part of the public quality reform, better welfare for the same money. That was also what Jette was referring to. We have a welfare model here in Denmark where we try to look after some of our weaker citizens. So we had a challenge saying, how might we create a more efficient and attractive meal service that increases the health and well-being of the growing elderly population in Denmark? This was one of the first times that a public welfare task in Denmark was used to solve, or design-driven innovation and design thinking was used to solve one of these problems. And we had Holstebro municipality who were our client. There are little facts that I wanted to share with you about the food service for elderly in Denmark. The meal service or the food service is a public service for elderly with a kind of functional decline, which means that they might not be able to shop for themselves and might not be able to stand up in the kitchen for as long as it takes to prepare a food. And generally there are two types of food service. There are either the delivery of cold vacuum packed food or delivery of a hot meal. But the cold vacuum packed food constitutes 2/3 of all municipalities, what they provide for the elderly. And it's because that way of handling the food preserves the nutritional values better, and it gives more freedom to the elderly in terms of when to actually prepare the food. In total, we have just about 130,000 elderly citizens receiving meal service. We have from 65 plus, that was the only number I could find, but basically in this target group, we are talking about people plus 75, I would say, but it's 1.1 million in Denmark at the moment. And of course, this number is rising as it is all over the world. So this is a kind of like a problem scope that will only become more relevant. And one of the main problems in relation to elderly and food is, of course, this risk underweight due to lack of appetite, due to lack of actual physical lack of taste and motivation to eat. And of course, that means that the poorer nutrition, the faster they deteriorate, and the faster they deteriorate, the bigger is the risk for them getting injured or sick. So if they lose muscle tissue, then they won't be as strong, then they might trip on something, then they might break something, then they will be committed to hospital. And in hospital, sadly, the statistics say that they will lose even more weight there because they lose appetite. And then they come home and then the kind of like the cycle continues. So it's very important to break this cycle and Jette, you were talking about dignity. I think it was you who talked about dignity. So it's very important to have also to keep these people in their home for as long as they can and making sure that they can help themselves. So if we're going to the process, the first thing about design thinking is actually this thing about dreaming, the dream phase, or onboarding the organization. And of course, that means that we need to identify all the stakeholders. In a municipality, you have multiple stakeholders. Then we need to establish a core project teams with decision makers and line of command. In this case, we had actually people working just below the mayor of the city, but also we have leadership on the ground, so to speak. So we had the chief in command in the kitchen. You need to plan the process design and the choice of methodology or methods, because even though as a designer we have a huge toolbox to work from, depending on the challenge and the scope, we need to pick out the methods that works the best. And sometimes you are dead wrong and you need to change your methodology somewhere along the line. Then we needed to decide the scope, who should be involved and when they should be involved. We did a point of departure workshop where we identified the short and long-term goals and barriers and possibilities, because in a project like this, we're also looking into technologies on how to actually produce the food and how to pack the food and how to all the logistics. We were looking into technologies about packaging design and so forth. Then one major lesson for us is that we always give our project a name, which is a motivating project name, because we know that will make it easier for us to talk about the project, but more importantly, it will make it easier for the client to talk about the project. So in this case, the municipality, they were able to talk about this, the Good Kitchen project, within their organization. And also it has this onboarding effect. And then, of course, if possible, to establish a baseline, which is also a very important thing about design, I think, is always to measure the progression along the project or along the way. So in this case, I think what is important to say about this is that in this initial workshop, we had this future service promise, which were that 75% of the food should be made from scratch and 100% must be made in close dialogue with the customers of the kitchen. Actually, I think it was the other way around. I think when we started, it was 25% of the food was made from scratch and the rest was actually a mix of ready-made stuff that were was bought. And the model I have to the right is just to say that once we have defined a service promise, it's very important as a design company. We are often hired in on the external line. So we have a client saying we have this product or this service that we would like to do better. And there is some ways that we should communicate this product or service once we have done it. But what we see as a design company is that we always need to bear in mind the internal line as well. So the culture and the structure, because we cannot produce a new service. But for instance, if the employees do not have a structure, an IT structure or a KPI structure or any other different kind of structure, if they're not given the time to actually work with this new product or service, they will not implement it. And also if the culture does not feel safe about doing this, for instance, in this case, we had a culture where people had the education, not as chefs, but as educated to make the most out of the budgets. So they were looking at prices, they were looking at the amounts and stuff like that, instead of looking at vitamins, how fresh the ingredients were and stuff like that. So that was also a thing that we needed to address in the culture. Going on to step one, the discovery phase. I'm just going to bring you a lot of images here, but I think besides it's being wonderful to go out to the elderly and actually experience how they work with this or prepare their meals, I think we found something interesting here. If you can see in the top left corner, you can see how the kitchen and the kitchen staff is dressed. It's slightly as we had a chef with us doing the observation. Sadly, I couldn't find a photo of that, but he had this very dry comment that he asked them, why are you wearing what seems to be nightgowns? He was saying, why aren't you wearing chef's uniforms? So that was an interesting thing seeing in the kitchen. Also, it was interesting to see, for instance, Esther, who's preparing and serving the meal directly in the tray, because everyone in the kitchen thought that she would be putting all the food into small bowls. And also you could see that to some extent, some of the citizens were still able to do some of their food themselves, but maybe not all of it. This is another where I think that the image of Peter eating directly from the tray, he was this typical widower whose wife always did the cooking, so he didn't have the skills to cook himself. Clearly, he does not recognize the fact that the appetite might be stimulated in a different way if you actually present the food in porcelain, for instance, instead of eating directly off the tray. So that was also interesting to see how the intake of the food was. And then going from observations and interviews to actually doing insights, I think is very important to kind of identify the right insights going along. And the difference, just to share with you, the difference between facts and observations and insights is actually this is just a pedagogical example, but a fact is that people tend to feed their pets twice a day. They feed them at breakfast and dinner time, which is a fact and an observation. But the insight is actually that the reason why people are feeding their pets around dinner time and breakfast, it's because they do not like to sit and eat if the pet is not fed as well. So I think that's interesting when you're working with insights, that you need to have insights that are actually providing a new information or some kind of discrepancy that you can actually work with as a designer. So the key insight that we had first was that the public meal service is actually seen as low status help. We had this quote saying, I must admit that I have asked the driver to park a little up the street when she delivers the food. I think the truck looks worse than a hearse, I think it is, but anyway, the wagon who carries the dead bodies away. And I also think it's awfully embarrassing that I cannot cook for myself anymore. To this thing about dignity. So actually we realized that only personal care people feared the most to lose their ability to do. So what you would like to lose the latest is you being able to wash yourself, for instance. But next to that, right next to that, comes your ability to cook your own meals, to shop for yourself, to decide what you would like to eat for yourself, which is like a really, really bad thing for people to lose. And then we saw cleaning and, sorry, I shouldn't say personal care, I should actually say bought help, for instance, for garden work and stuff like that in the lower bottom there. The point is just that food and meals are very important things for us to be able to keep authority over. So I think that was something that we didn't realize before this project. Another key insight is that public meal service is actually also considered as a low status job. which means that the people who are working in the kitchen, they were kind of embarrassed to say that they were working in the kitchen and they didn't really feel motivated to work there. But that has something to do with the way they wrote their schedule, because they had the same schedule for 3 months in a row, which was okay in the beginning, but then it's starting to get uninspiring. Also, it had something to do with the way they were dressed, the way the ingredients that they were working with, where they mostly just cut up bags and stuff that they would then heat or put together with different ingredients. And what was very interesting about having this chef with us for observations was that he would actually see that their kitchen techniques were at a very high level. So when they didn't produce food that was made from the scratch, it was not about them not being able to, but it was actually just a question of the wrong priorities from a logistic point of view in how you spend your budget and what priorities do you have when you spend your budget. Also, we had another key insight saying that the appetite starts at the fridge. And if you can see that Jens here to your right, if you can see that he has actually quite some food in his fridge, but all the packaging is white and the fridge is typically white. So when he opened the fridge, basically what he saw was white. And if you look at the other image of the fridge, is that you see a lot of liquids, but you see not much food. And again, this thing about looking into an empty fridge, it doesn't really stimulate your appetite. And it's very important to look at how to stimulate your appetite when you're an elderly. Also because what we saw was that the elderly, they were kind of hesitating to have this formal dinner meal, because when they had the dinner meal, they just realized what they actually saw was all the people who were not with them to have their dinner and who was usually there, because most of them has lost a husband or a wife. Some of them, they do not get visits from their kids as often as they would like to. So for them, actually the actual dinner situation, which was what the kitchen would cater for when we started, was actually not a very pleasant situation. So that was also something that we needed to look into. Then we also saw something interesting, and I think that's very characteristic for this generation that we have of elderly in Denmark at the moment. They supplement anyway the ones who are not living. This is Holstebro, which is a fairly big city, but of course it's not Copenhagen or Aarhus, some of the major cities, but still. You could see that they supplemented their meals by exchange economy. So for instance, if you had some eggs, you would change them for some pork chops. Then you would have a daughter who has been baking some bread and you can change that for something else. So that is just a way that this generation used to live, which was also something that they would bring with them into this meal service. Then if we should look at the insight and idea, this workshop where we invited, of course, staff from the kitchen, but also staff from the home care section, which we also invited politicians. And we actually, for the lunch there, we served the food from the kitchen so that we made sure that everybody would actually try out the food from the kitchen. But what was interesting about this was that one of the caretakers actually said, okay, because one of the things that we work with here that you see in the top right corner is food service as a restaurant. So that's what we call a radical analogy. Of course, in this sense, it's not that radical in itself, but it's just by looking at things slightly different makes you realize some pitfalls or dark areas or gray spots or whatever you call it in your own service. And one of the caretakers actually said, so, okay, if the kitchen is the chef's, then I would be the waiter. And if I'm the waiter, then maybe I shouldn't talk about which food Mrs. Jensen would like to have while I'm helping her going to the toilet, because the waiter would never provide a service like that. So this catalyzed a way of how to talk differently about the meal and to look at the meal differently, also as something proactive. Then we went to the prototype design and the test. Of course, we tried out new dishes. So you can just see that, of course, ideation is sketching, it's building, it's trying out new things. You can see that we were trying out new dishes, suggestions that the kitchen had made for new dishes. So in this sense, we tried to motivate and ignite, so to speak, the employees to also provide inspiration for each other. We tested out stuff with the elderlies. We did a way to present the menu in an entire new way, so it was more like menu card from a restaurant. So we tried that out to see if the elderly could see the size of the letters, for instance, if they could understand how to order in a slightly different way and stuff like that. And among the final solutions were we created Like in order to address this thing about public meal service as being something embarrassing, we created a whole new visual identity where you can see the old identity here in the bottom left corner, Centralkøkkenet. But now we had an identity much more like a private company. Then we had personas in the kitchen because we wanted the kitchen staff to realize who they were actually preparing food for. We had the new uniform, so they were much more dressed like chefs, which had an amazing effect on their pride in going to work. We changed the name from Centralkøkkenet to the Good Kitchen. You see here on the left the former menu and the new menu and the new labels on the dishes. We also worked with them on the presentation of the food so that when they would receive the food, it would be more appetizing. And also the way that we communicated the different dishes. So instead of actually calling it pork, we called it main course, for instance. Then we did a manifest that we're looking into this thing about doing homemade cooking with fresh ingredients from local suppliers, because you have a lot of really good local suppliers. So that was also a different way of presenting the food, saying that this was something from one in main town, Holstebro, or the different suppliers, because everyone in this municipality would know what we were talking about. Then we had these feedback cards that the citizens could write back for the kitchen with ideas for new dishes or something that they didn't thought was right, you know, the size of the dishes or the preparation or whatever. And then once a month, actually, the section leader here, she picked out some of these and defined that they would be working with these for the next month. So it wasn't just like a dialogue tool, it was also implemented in the way that they would provide their service. And lastly, we created some tasting sessions with the staff and also with the citizens so that we made sure that all the staff would know what they would be eating, how the food that they would prepare would actually taste. Because one thing is to prepare a sauce and then just taste the sauce, and the sauce might taste great. But then if you serve it with some vegetables that are also salted or some meat that is also salted, then maybe the final dish doesn't really taste well together. Yes, and then of course we had some reorganizing and some new collaborations and cooperative processes. Of course, all of this project was very much a co-creative process with the kitchen staff. And just to come back to this, saying that in this we really discovered how important culture and structure also is to work with as a designer to make sure that things are implemented. And actually we still have, although it's been a couple of years since this solution, we still have regular contact with the kitchen, and they still work very iteratively, trying out new things and testing it and deciding whether to progress with it or not. So I think it's very important to always kind of put a number to your results, even though there might be qualitative results as well. We actually saw a decrease in sickness absence in the kitchen staff from 11.5% to 3.5%. And this is actually 1.5% below the municipality's goal, which is a dramatically, this project in total was done in 6 months. So this is actually a decrease in 6 months. So this, of course, is an indication that the kitchen staff was now much more motivated, much more energized to go to work. Then we had 112% increase in sales of energy-dense dishes, which is really important with this specific target group because they would be able to manage better. I would never say that you should use meals as medicine, but coming back to you, Jette, and your proactive approach to healthcare, I think that's something that we in Denmark, and I think it might be different in India, but in Denmark, we really lack the respect of how important food is in this concern. Then we had a 27 increase in average sales per customer, a 63 increase in customers who were very satisfied with the food service. We had a 74% of the malnourished gained weight. This was measured in a year. And then we had a decrease in registered diseases as a result of malnutrition in the municipality. So as you can see, this is not even translated into numbers, budgets, but you can see these are very, very powerful results coming from a project that has been fairly quickly and fairly intense. And of course, I just have to show this because this is actually the Crown Prince of Denmark. He gave us Danish Design Award. We were also nominated to the Index Award that Jette was mentioned, and the case is mentioned by Jane Litka, who is from Columbia Business School, who was working very much with service design and what design can do to increase sustainable life and social welfare. Yes, that was all for me.
Thank you, Lotte. Now we'll move from food to food for thought. Our second speaker is Jacob Matthew. Jacob trained as an industrial designer. He also co-founded one of India's first and, in my view, coolest consulting design firms, Tesseract. Jacob has changed track. He is now the CEO of Industry Foundation. He spent the first 25 years of his life using design to transform businesses. Now he's trying to use businesses, design, and entrepreneurship to transform society in India and Africa. Now, Jacob is sitting in Goa right now. He's here to ask whether designers could help redesign capitalism itself. Jacob, if you could put your beer down, the floor is all yours.
Thank you. So first of all, an apology if there is a lot of background noise because of where I'm sitting. That sign there probably indicates clearly as to where I am. I'm talking about design and how design can sort of look at what we could call a gentler, kinder capitalism. Lotte talked about something which is very important, which sort of runs through, design overall. And this is the shift of design from a problem-solving activity to what you would call an aspiration-fulfilling activity. So she spoke about dignity, she spoke about pride in work and things like that. And I think this is what design is uncovering now. So it's not like an engineering solve the problem, but it's really about solving people's aspirations. Raghuram Rajan, who's pictured here, is an economist and was the former governor of the Reserve Bank of India. In his book, The Third Pillar, he laments that state and market have come together in ways that are sometimes mind-boggling, and in the process has left community as mere bystanders. One could argue that both state and the market stand to serve community. But I think in this mad rush of business, shareholder wealth creation, and so on, the people who both markets and state have to serve have been forgotten. And I could say that this is for much of the world, not just India. The last couple of months have seen a very unusual activity in India, where the richest Indian business has been rewarded beyond expectation, I would say. It's almost like the sharks in the business ocean sensed a new monopoly in the making. And there was this, I would say, fantastic feeding frenzy of people lining up to throw money at a business that has all the makings of a monopoly. And it's interesting that investors like to put their money into what could be an unassailable monopoly. So, it's almost like money begets money, but money begets money when there is a monopoly involved or the possibility of a monopoly involved. And the people who've been throwing money include some of the largest, you could say, monopolistic firms like Google, like Facebook, and so on, who are actually controlling pretty much most of the world's information. And they're right on top. And it's very interesting to see where their money is going. What's interesting is Ambani, who is the richest man in India, has pretty much doubled his wealth in the period between March and September of this year, when the entire world was going through a very difficult time. But he's not alone. I call this my laughing billionaire slide. So you see that Jeff Bezos saw something like close to $100 billion increase in net worth. Elon Musk added 57 billion. His wealth went up 3 times during this March to September period. Mark Zuckerberg added about 25 billion to his net worth. Contrast that with the image on the left, which says that in 12 weeks, 44.1 million people were unemployed in the US. But at the same time, US wealth, billionaire wealth, went up by $637 billion. Amazon, which sort of leads the pack here, and a company that all of us depend on, we are very loyal to, was accused of price gouging on items like toilet paper and disinfectant soap, which seems rather immoral. But when you talk to people in Amazon, they say that, look, we didn't do it, our algorithms did it. Our algorithms have a logic of their own, and it's very difficult to mechanically intervene without upsetting a lot of systems. So in a sense, they're saying, actually not our fault, the machine done it. Coming to India, we had a lockdown that was announced by the state. It was announced without any warning. And within weeks, millions of people found it difficult, who had migrated to cities, found it difficult to continue living in cities. And since public transport had been suspended, started walking home. And a few thousands of these people died on their way home. This is again when the state acts in a very callous manner. I just want to talk about some alternatives to this kind of system. And this is what the organization that I work with, Industry Foundation, has been doing. So we organize women in rural India into groups. So one of the things that this does is that it slows down migration. It brings work to where the people are, rather than taking the people to where the work is. What happened as soon as the pandemic lockdowns were announced, was that we started reaching out to people. And this chart sort of lays out how we reached out to the people working in these enterprises, rural enterprises, largely women owned. These are producer owned enterprises. How we started reaching out to them. So you can see the numbers going up to 700 over a period of 8 weeks. It means that every woman who worked in our system was reached out to by a supervisor in their unit to find out how they were doing, how they were dealing with the pandemic, giving them information about how to handle things, how to take care of themselves, and then move on to how they could help themselves and their families. So we instituted things like making masks for yourself, for your family, and for your neighbors. We used digital technology because travel was not possible that time. So we used mobile phones, we used digital phones, and we also used IVR systems, voice activated mobile systems for disseminating information to people. What I'm proud to say is that all the women who were prior to working in the kind of organizations that we've set up, which are women owned, the workers own these organizations, got probably a better level of service than they would have got had they been in the organized sector. So these are artisans. These are people who work with their hands, craftspeople. And craft in India is typically considered part of the unorganized sector. But the support and the continuation of benefits that they got during this pandemic time was equal, if not better than what they would have got had they been in a multinational corporation. I do believe that it is possible to have care built into a business system, especially when it's owned by the people who work there. We work with value chains, and again, we look at integrated value chains. So those 700 women that we looked at, the numbers that we looked at, all work in units that use agriculture waste, which is banana bark. And that is fashioned into products. You know, it's sometimes twisted into rope. It is hand spliced or machine spliced. Then it goes into handloom weaving if required. And it gets fabricated in a number of ways. They use crochet, they use mechanical fabrication, and so on. For this company, which is called Greencraft, Greencraft's largest customer is IKEA, and they supply to IKEA through something called the IKEA Social Entrepreneurs Movement. Their other customers include H&M from Sweden, and there are a few boutique buyers out of France, and a few buyers in the US as well. If you talk to most global value chain players, most of them cannot see beyond their what are called their tier one suppliers. A tier one supplier is somebody that I buy directly from. Some of them know a little bit about their tier two suppliers. Very few know anything about tier three suppliers. And it's almost like if you can't see it, you don't know it. So what we found was that if you needed to have transparency and traceability all the way through, then you have to design these businesses to be able to do it. So we look at integrated value chains right from the banana plantation. So here is a plantation where the banana bunches have just been harvested. Typically what would have been done is the trunks would be cut, hauled off somewhere to dry, and then they would be burnt so that it could make way for the next crop. In our case, we've trained these women to peel the bark off, dry it, and then supply it downstream to another set of women who convert it into rope using very simple rope making machines. This then comes to sort of a factory-like unit where it's woven. And here you can see we use jigs to maintain dimensional stability. We use methods like lean manufacturing that we've borrowed from the automobile industry to ensure that productivity is high. Because at the end of the day, earnings have to be much higher than the minimum wages that are declared by the government, but should meet and exceed what we call fair living wages, which means that at the end of the day, there's money to save and they are on a path to prosperity. This is hand macrame or crochet that is being done. These are some of the products being readied for market. And these are the finished products. And look at another value chain. Here we work with what are called particularly vulnerable tribes. These are tribal communities that live in the forests in Orissa, and they have access to leaves and fallout from the forest that they're allowed to gather. So NTFP stands for non-timber forest produce. Women go into the forest, collect leaves, they sort them, and at their village itself, at the place close to where they live, there is a small unit where they do hand stitching of leaves together to form what are traditional disposable plates. But we don't stop there. We move it to a machining unit where it goes through a sewing machine, and then it goes through a hydraulic pressing process. It's packaged, and then it's off to market. This is a substitute for plastic products. And again, this woman, for example, her cash earning in a month used to be 100 rupees, which is about maybe $1.25, not a day, but a month. That was her cash earning. By making these hand-stitched leaf plates and by eliminating a few middlemen, we were able to increase their earning from 100 rupees a month to 500 rupees a month. Now, what we're doing is getting into the next level where some mechanization is brought in, hydraulic pressing is being done. And from 500 rupees, our target is to take them up to 5,000 rupees, which would actually be a 50x increase in income. And this is where design really comes in. How do we communicate to customers what these products mean, how it is good for them, and how it contributes to a green planet? These are some explorations that our designers have been doing in making products that last a little longer, but otherwise these are substitutes for biodegradable products. Similarly, when I look at this is a farm to fashion value chain that we are working on in Ethiopia. So you have small farmers here. Our next stage of integration is where we put up a micro spinning unit, which supplies yarn to a hand weaving unit, which supplies fabric to a tailoring unit, which supplies fashion to the market. So it's again integrating the value chain. Now, the problem that we are trying to address is that if yarn came here, most of the time you do not have an idea of how the yarn was produced. So when we went and explored, we found that most of these smallholder farmers end up being landless labor. A lot of their women end up getting trafficked. And even when they work on other people's farms, the women actually work in dive bars where they're forced into prostitution during the cotton picking season. So very often, our value chains, when you go deeper into it, hide some very unpleasant facts that never come into the limelight unless you're really interested in finding out. So this is our weaving unit in Ethiopia. We have shared improved looms. So these improved looms are by German designer. We've just introduced Indian hand looms there that will increase the productivity. That's a finished product from the tailoring unit. And then we have embroidery for adding further value to the stitched garments. We're doing the same thing in bamboo, where again, we are looking at an integrated approach right from bamboo plantation so that you ensure that making more products doesn't cut into food supply. And these are the products that are being made using traditional skills. And it's a traditional community called the Medars in Karnataka, India, who are manufacturing these now. How do we organize ourselves for this? And one of the things that we've had to do is to upend the traditional structure of a company. And our leadership team is really at the bottom of the stack. We call them enablers. So people like me, I'm the CEO of the organization, but I do the job of the roots of a tree. We've sort of used a biology-inspired business structure of a rainforest, where people like me are the roots. We have a group of professional managers who include designers, merchandisers, production specialists, who sort of form the canopy. And at the emergent layer, where the leaves hit the sunshine, where the action happens, That's where the women that we work with exist in our organization structure. And it is actually an organization structure that is serving people above it. And the leaves and the fruits are the units. So this is a sort of an organization structure because we found that the typical command and control pyramidal structure doesn't work. It's not dynamic enough, and it sort of inverts the power structure. And just to finish up, in terms of design principles that we use, we look at growth. Growth is very important, but growth without purpose violates nature. And that's where we suffer from things like climate change. I expect that many of you are familiar with Kate Raworth's work, where she talks about donut economics, which is a floor of what society requires, that everybody requires without exception, and a ceiling which cannot exceed the carrying capacity of the planet. So that's one of the design principles that we use. I just talked to you about our bio-inspired organization structure. The role of women can never be underestimated. And in India and many other countries, women perform unrecognized, unpaid, and unrewarded work. We are part of a process. So we are designing in a process for a process. And this process is a move to prosperity for all. We are market-led. We are very cognizant about market. We are very cognizant that business and capitalism is a very, very powerful tool, but you cannot be controlled by it. So again, going back to the first principle, which is growth with purpose, you have to be market-led, but not market-controlled. The next one is tread lightly, be regenerative. So there's been a lot of damage done to the planet, and it's our job now, not just to do no damage, but to roll back the damage that has been done all these years. And lastly, I would say, no externalities. Most businesses say that, hey, this is what we do, and that's not our job. So, I mean, one of the questions I think raised here is, should cities have high rises? I think that is one of the questions asked in the, and how do you do high rise cities? The question I would ask is, why do you have so many people in a city where you need high rises? So I would go to that question. A lot of governments and so on blame things on externalities. So I will make my plastic drinking water bottle. I have one right here. I will drink from it. And when I throw it away, it's somebody else's job to take care of it. When I use petrochemicals, I don't pay the entire price for it. Now, these are things called externalities. And as part of regenerative economies, you cannot have anything as an externality. What is most critical for us is who we are working for and what they have to say. So this video sort of tells us about what they have to say.
मेरे से ही बोलती हूँ घर पे मैं 15 साल से आके मेरे घर पे काम कर रही थी कोई इतनी मेरी सास है ससुर है मेरा देवर है मेरा नंदान थे कोई मुझको सपोर्ट नहीं किया मैंने क्या पता है मुझे घर पे बैठ के काम करके दूसरों को काम करके देना अच्छा लग रहा है फिर भी बाहर वालों को पता चलना चाहिए मैं कितना काम कर सकती हूँ मैं कितना मेरा पावर मेरे पास कितना है गांव में एक किरगावर के अंदर एक सूर्या लड़की रहती है इतना अच्छा काम करती है वो बाहर निकल के उसके पाँव को खुद खड़े होना रहना चाहती है हर लड़की को यही करना चाहिए हर लड़की को डरना नहीं चाहिए मुझको सिर्फ मेरे बच्चों को पढ़ाना है मेरे पति को हेल्प करना है आइंदा इम्प्रूव होना है मुझे इतने साल इम्प्रूव नहीं हुई मैं अभी इम्प्रूव होना
தெரியட்டுமே நான் சாருங்கிட்டயுமே சொன்னேன் நான் இது இப்படி பண்ணா சரிப்படுத்தலாம்னு சொன்னேன் எல்லாத்தையுமே அவங்களே என்கரேஜ் பண்ணி அவங்களா QC டிபார்ட்மெண்ட்ல எடுத்து தேர்ந்தெடுத்து போட்டாங்க 5 வருஷத்துக்கு பிற்பாடு எப்படி மாறுதோ தெரியல இப்பயுமே நாங்க தான் அந்த கம்பெனி ஆல்ரவுண்டர் ଗ୍ରୁପେ இருக்கு
ପ୍ରଥମେ ଛୋଟରୁ ବଡ ପର୍ଯ୍ୟନ୍ତ ଯୋଉଟା କି ଆରମ୍ଭ କରିବାକୁ ପଡିବ ମାନେ ଛୋଟରୁ କହିଲେ ଗାଁରୁ ହଉ କି ଗ୍ରୁପରୁ ହଉ ସେ ଭିତରୁ ଆମକୁ ପ୍ରଥମେ ଆରମ୍ଭ କରିବାକୁ ପଡିବ ତାପରେ ସେଟା ବଢି ବଢି ଯିବ ତାପରେ ବଢି ବଢି ଯାଇକି ପୁରା ଦୁନିଆକୁ ସେଟା ପାଇଯିବ
Thank you.
Now, the first question for you. Your customer is the municipality for the good kitchen. They're the ones paying you to do this. But your consumer is not the one paying you. They're the elderly. How do you deal with it when your customer wants something else and your consumer wants something else?
Well, I think that's the beauty about working with user-centered design, is that basically if I've never experienced a situation where if I could show what the end user would like or prefer, that the customer wouldn't agree with that, because they see, of course, that that is where their market and their business opportunity is going, and it is a business opportunity for a municipality. Even so, you know, in that sense, it's very important to document and observe and do these kinds of insights. And of course, by users, it's both the elderly, but actually in this project, it turned out to be also the employees, right? So this, in this, the municipality, the Good Kitchen, they also gained employer branding out of this, actually being able to attract better employees.
And in this model, do the elderly pay for the food, or does the government pay for the food for the elderly?
It's split. So the government pays something, and the elderly pays like, I think it's about 1/3 they pay for themselves. So actually the Good Kitchen is competing with private industries as well.
How important are the elderly in Denmark as a political constituency? Do they vote, for instance, and do politicians think of them when they campaign?
Not enough, I would say, but we have a big discussion in Denmark talking about paying tribute to what they have actually, you know, they have been paying taxes for many years. They have established a lot of the things that we are building our society on today. So I think the general public opinion is that we need to be much more kind to our elderly and respect them more. But sadly, when political decisions are being made, they're not the most economically strong election group or voting group. Yeah.
All right. Jacob, question for you. So great examples on banana fiber and the leaf products that you showed us. You talked about taking work to people and sort of bringing people to work. But how do you see us producing cars and cell phones using this ideology?
I think there is a concept of horses for horses, but one cannot use the same brush on every situation. I would like to talk about a small example of the Tata Nano. When the Tata Nano was conceptualized, it was conceptualized as distributed manufacturing. There would be certain parts of the car which would be made in central units. But the whole idea was that, I mean, apart from the huge communication failure, that parts of these cars would be, the actual assembly of these cars would happen in distributed small town, not village, but small town units, where a group of mechanics could get together and it would be a kit of parts that they would assemble. I mean, that was the actual dream of the Nano. So I would say that it's not impossible. It can be done. Again, who are we doing this stuff for? And again, if we look at this, I mean, a principle of no externalities, I think a lot of things become clearer.
Another question I have for you. A lot of what you do sounds like the Amul model. I don't know if you've ever heard Aris Sodhi speak. He's a very funny guy. And one of the things he said is that the mandate of Amul, Amul is a milk cooperative in India. A lot of they buy milk from small farmers and they create milk products. So the CEO says, my job is to pay as much as I can to the producers of the milk and charge as little as I can for my consumers. Right? It would seem that the entire company is not motivated by a profit maximization credo, if you will. So it's the exact opposite of the Reliances and the Amazons and the Teslas that you spoke about. How do you see natural monopolies, a Google or an Amazon or a Tesla, ever becoming a company like this?
I spent some of my time teaching. And what I do teach is sometimes to take the long view. And I sometimes think it's not just the long view, but it's also the long ethical view. So, I mean, one technique that we use is to have a 100-year vision. What do you see your company doing 100 years from now? What will they remember you for 100 years from now? So that is a question that I would put to the Larry and Sergey and ask them, like, what do you think people will talk about you 100 years from now? Amazon, fantastic, until recently. And today people are beginning to dislike Amazon for its size and for its practices. So they do deliver low prices to customers. The algorithms go crazy sometimes, as they say, but they are also terrible employers.
We've heard.
They look at frugality and they take it to such an extent where they pay below minimum wage and things like that. So I think the means are as important as the end. I hope it doesn't come to open revolt on the streets.
Mhm.
Yeah, but you can already see some of that beginning to
Kinds
happen.
of people not buying
Right.
big monopolies.
Yes, and boycotting goods. Yes.
Jacob, Kirti Jaju asks, good question. What is market-led but not controlled? How do you distinguish between market-led and market controlled?
Yeah. So again, Suresh, going back to your point about delivering shareholder value or delivering stakeholder value, there's just a small difference in the two words. But when we say market-led and market-controlled is very often, in a sense, the tail wagging the dog. The investors decide what you do because you have to bring returns to their money. And there is no end to what that return can be. There is a notion that is now being discussed quite a bit, especially in the cooperative economy segment. I'm actually part of something called digital platform co-ops now that look at these big digital platforms being operated in a cooperative way, right? So these are questions being asked. What is a fair profit? Can it be anything? I mean, like in business school, when we learn business, we learn that don't leave any money on the table. If you can get your customers to pay more, take it. Don't leave it on the table. But these are things that we need to question now. So I hope I've answered that question. Thank you.
You have. Lotte, there's a viewer called Sai Mohanty who asked you a question. He's saying the insight about people feeling awkward at dinner was quite interesting. And one of the key problems of the elderly is loneliness. Food is one part. He says, what else do you think can take away their loneliness? Should we have social events for them? Maybe dancing, maybe beer in the garden? What else are communities in Denmark doing for them?
It's a very good comment. I think one of the things that we tried out, which we didn't manage to get through, was actually to have dining groups between the elderly, because the kitchen knows them quite well, because they had conversations with them, and they have chauffeurs, of course, delivering the meal. Another thing that we did manage to implement was actually the possibility to buy food for social dining events. If I get food delivered from a municipality, why can I only order food for myself? Why can I not order for my family, for instance? Because that was something that that was very important for them, that they had been taken away from, was this opportunity to invite the entire family, right? So that was one of the things that we integrated, and that was a massive success from the beginning, because then they were able to buy delicious food from the Good Kitchen and invite their family and or friends, and in this way become social. Because I definitely agree that the social aspect should be one of the things that we should prompt more.
Okay, Jacob, another question for you from Amrita Adhikari. This is great presentation. In all this, how important is communicating your story? What you did just now with us, how do you communicate that to a consumer, for instance? It's a fairly elaborate chain of things to understand for the consumer. How do you simplify the story?
Very often our products go with slightly elaborate hang tags. Sometimes our retailers, take IKEA for example, they celebrate us in their stores. They set up special displays, and then they talk about the stories. The lady who spoke second last, who talked about being an owner in the business, just before lockdown, she went on a whirlwind tour of 5 Indian cities in 4 days, where she met IKEA staff in their warehouse, in their store, in their buying office, and in their India office. And she taught them how to weave banana bark baskets. So, in a sense, she sort of had ambassadors across the company, at the store, at the warehouse, and so on. So this is one way where we spread the word. The other is that we do use some amount of social media and stuff, but very often what we do is that we have slightly more elaborate hang tags on our products, which talks about the story of the product.
Then we have a lot of social media entrepreneurs and influencers in this audience. If any of them would like to help you communicate your story, I'm sure they should get in touch with you and build a social media narrative around some of the products you're creating.
That would be great.
Lotta, this is for you. Shobit Malya asks, as you mentioned, there are a lot of tools for the design process and the design thinking process. How should a designer understand what tool is appropriate for what circumstance? How do you choose?
Yes, that's an extremely difficult question, because that has, of course, something to do with experience and also with personality as a designer, which tools are you more comfortable with. But I would say that, of course, interviews and observations, tools number 1 and 2, and ideation, of course, is a tool as well, and testing. So if I were a new designer, or if design was new for me, that would be the 4 that I would kind of like dig into. And then you have all sorts of different arrays of slightly different methodologies within these 4 key areas that you can kind of like explore and see what suits you the best, or what suits the situation the best, because of course that's also a very ethical situation where you need to be very much in respect of the context that you are entering. So for instance, there's a difference whether we go into a hospital where you have people who are committed and people who might be in a very, very vulnerable situation, whereas it's different if we go into a school, for instance.
All right, that brings us to the end of this. Thank you, Jacob. Thank you, Lotte. Thank you, Jette. Most importantly, thank you to our audience. Thank you for giving us your time. Thank you for the questions and your engagement. Thanks to our partners. We have 3 partners: Ethos, Climate Collective, and ADI. Now, our next episode in this series is called The Question of Waste. We're going to talk about some of the issues that were brought up today. We'll explore design solutions to the problem of waste. That's coming soon. Till then, my advice to you is wear a mask, wash your hands, and maintain social distance as much as you can. And if you can be like Jacob, go to Goa and have a good time. They work from Goa. All right, Lotte and Jacob, thank you very much. This brings us to the end. Yeah, we can see Jacob. Now you're just showing off. We can see the sea.
You're just showing off, Jacob.
Yeah, you're just showing off.
Goodbye.
All right, thank you very much. Oh, Jette is back. Jette,
Thank you for having us.
would you like to say a few words, Jette, to close?
I just wanted also to say thank you very much. Very enlightening stories, and yeah, I just think it's very thrilling and motivating to hear these stories. So thank you so much.
Thank you, Jette. Thank you, Lotte. Thank you, Jacob. Thank you, members of the audience. We'll see you soon again. Bye.
Thank you.